Record on this. Cool. And welcome back to No More Nonversations. Got my buddy Dave Bailey joining me today. How you doing, Dave?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. So we'll jump right in. We've had a lot of great conversations over the past couple of weeks regarding the educational process, things that can be taught in schools, critical race theory, the history of the nation, interracial relationships, and basically just how we should engage in America in general to move forward. So I guess to start out, let's pick up on holidays. That was one of our one of the topics that we talked about last time. And I was kind of the position that, you know, if we're it was started with Christopher Columbus, not, you know,
Right.
not giving him a holiday when you really consider his role in American history. But you think that we should keep him, correct?
Yeah, well, I think there's two questions we're trying to answer here. One is the worth of holidays, or holding anybody up as heroes, I think was your point, which I might have some agreement with you on that. I think we are way too hero worshiping, particularly of individuals, and we individualize everything instead of deal with the principle and the main point behind why we are celebrating something. And so I think I think that's one part of the discussion, which you and I actually, especially from sort of a libertarian viewpoint, I kind of agree with. I think we way too much hold up heroes. But the second part of that was, what are we celebrating on Columbus Day? And so that was where we started, and then kind of went beyond that and saying all holidays. So I think those are almost two separate subjects. If we are going to have holidays, which ones are worthy of having a holiday for? Because if you're going to, you can't have holidays for everything, although it feels like we're going to be at some point. We're having holidays a lot more now. But, at some point you're selectively picking which holiday you have and which ones you don't. And so I think that's where the conversation. The reason why, so just getting to Columbus Day, I think it's been sort of two problems with why that Columbus Day has been under attack. And I think it mostly comes from an attack on Western civilization, which I think is by far honorable to celebrate, and probably more so now than ever before in our history. I think there's a value in understanding the problems with history. There's a value in understanding the context, but there's also a value in honoring certain milestones that were crossed and certain things that should be emulated or upheld. I think that's true in sports. I think that's true in everything. You have an ideal, and there's a difference between the ideal and the man or the individual. I think that's where some of the disagreement or crosstalk happens. I don't think the arguments against or for are really talking about the same thing. So I know that was a mouthful, but
so you said that you think that there is an attack, like it's important to honor them because you think there's kind of attack on Western modernization. Is that what I heard?
Western civilization.
Western civilization.
Yeah, and particularly every question needs to be asked in compared to what. It's kind of a Thomas Sowell axiom, is compared to what. You can't take any subject out of context. You can't put it in a vacuum and saying compare it to the ideal or compare it to some utopia that doesn't exist. So I think Western civilization was a milestone that deserves to be saluted, and it's being the opposite is having more detrimental effects than really standing up for it. So I think more now than ever it needs to be stood up for.
Like in what ways? Because I haven't seen personally, I don't feel like there's been an attack on Western civilization. So what are you classifying as attacks against Western civilization?
Oh, I think almost everything has an anti-capitalist kind of undertone to it. And Western civilization and capitalism is as defined by free market capitalism, not by crony capitalism, not by a lot of things that are called capitalism today. It's not when the government gets together with the business and puts it together. It's when free people interact in commerce. And capitalism is just the extension, really, of freedom, of individual freedom, not group freedom. And so Western civilization, and I would argue Judeo-Christian, the emergence of Judeo-Christian values, and throughout time was novel in that respect and unique. And I even use the word exceptional, which I knew you kind of jumped when we had this conversation before, because it has a different connotation, I think. But it's exceptional in that it's unique to anywhere in the world at the time, and I would argue still to this day in many respects. It doesn't mean that you lived up to the ideals. In fact, generally, man will always fall short of its ideals, and but it's worth shooting for those ideals. So Western civilization is, I think, under attack in that capitalism is. The idea of free people interacting is. We can get into free speech and all that comes with that. When I was flying back and forth between China, I did a lot of travels to Asia a while ago for business I was involved with. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the business was going over and talking to young people over there. Really, I was working for an investor here, and we were finding businesses and really mentoring young guys and gals that were really, were doing some amazing things. But we got into all these discussions. But on the flights between the countries, businessmen in the U.S., people that work for Accenture or Goldman Sachs or anybody that was doing something kind of big over in China, were emulating the China model. We're talking about how great it was that they could build a bullet train between Hangzhou and Shanghai without a lot of interference from those pesky people that they might be, tearing down their homes to put the train through. And, it sort of reminded me of an argument from history when fascism and things were taking root, that, hey, it was super efficient at first. And you can be very efficient if you trample on individual rights for a period of time. It also reminded me of when I worked for Toyota years ago in the 80s, and how Japan was going to take over all the world with Japan Inc., which is sort of a nicer version of fascism in a way, just a corporate fascism over in Japan at the time. And so you do have both at I think at the elite level, a deference for, we'd like to have more of an authoritative state versus really true capitalism. So that's why I think it's more than ever. It's not just coming from college campuses and young people who don't seem to know what socialism was and what it did over this last century. It's coming from both ends. And so that's why I think it's truly under assault.
Yeah, and under assault, I don't know if I'd agree with that term, because I see a challenge is different from an assault. I definitely feel that there's probably some capitalistic values or ideals that are being challenged, but I don't know about assault. And then on top of that, like, there are aspects of socialism in our country. That's what social security is, right? So
Yes.
there's like some good aspects, because I absolutely feel that capitalism is a good thing, but it's been like perverted. It's been taken to the extremes to where we are trampling on people, but we're doing it in a classy way. But it almost seems comparable to what China was doing when they weren't, having to ask people to take over their property and just build a bullet train because it's what they thought that was best for the country or the economy. But it almost seems like we're doing that, but we're just calling it something different.
Yeah, Michael, your voice is going in and out. I don't know if it's on my end.
It's probably better
now. Yeah, it seemed that it was
too
kind of going back and forth. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out this thing.
It might be my end too. I don't know. Look, I'm generally a libertarian. I'm not generally. I am a very libertarian, almost anarchist in the way I view in my ideals of philosophy. I don't think it's practical in a lot of cases. So when you do quote Social Security, I might argue with you that's not been well played. But I do understand that there are some places for socialism. I think if you have an 80-year-old woman or an 80-year-old man that knows no one, we're going to take care of them, and probably the only way you can, although this is even arguable, is through a safety net that the government needs to provide for the helpless, for the truly helpless. Although I do think they push out charities and individual initiative almost all the time that they get involved. And when I say they, the government gets involved, almost by definition, it pushes out the elements that were there that would do a better job of taking care of the elderly and the downtrodden or those that need that safety net. So I'm not, I guess, a purist in that there are elements of socialism that are necessary, but we are way, way, way beyond that. And I don't think a lot of what needs to be focused on is, if you're playing a football game, basketball game, or you got to look at the scoreboard every once in a while. A lot of ideas sound good, but the results are horrible. I think in terms of the Great Society and all the programs that have been put in place, they don't have the desired outcome, even though they might have been well-intentioned. And so I think a lot of things we're going to talk about, I think the idea is, well, does that lead to a better place? And not that we're in a perfect place, not that the economy is in a perfect place, but I think we'd be a heck of a lot better off if we had more true capitalism in this country. And I would put, when I say capitalism, I think one of the enemies of capitalism is big tech, is the way that once corporations get so big, they cozy up way too well with government, and they write the laws, they write the regulations, they manage the legal system. I own a small company. I compete against big companies. The deck is completely stacked against the small guy. If you go to court and you're fighting, you have a dispute with a large company, they can tear up a contract right in front of your face, and you're not going to really be able to execute. You're not going to be able to, even though you look at the contract and it looks like you would win, defending it is a whole nother thing. And so the laws are stacked against the small guy, and I would probably find agreement with you that we should get together and get rid of all the advantages that are given to the powerful and the large. We'd be a better place if we really empower the disruptors and the people that are putting it all on the line, but maybe don't want to fit into the corporate kind of the corporate kind of formula that I think is also a cancer on the society right now. So a lot of the dispute we might have is capitalism working, or here's pain points, here's where it's failing. I might agree with you. I think we would disagree on the solution.
Okay, fair. So when you're classifying something as like if we had an environment in which there was, you said, pure capitalism, do you basically mean like where the small company is able to compete like with the large company without the large company just making everyone else bend to their will? Is that kind of what that means?
Well, sure. If you look at a Facebook, the guy, Zuckerberg started that in his dorm, kind of stole it from some other guys at Harvard. He started off as almost a gag, and he took off, and he did great with it, right? But he was about going around all the rules that you could possibly go around. And then he gets to be the billionaire and write the rules. And now he's calling for regulation. The reason he's calling for regulation is because he doesn't want the next guy in his dorm room trying to create the next Facebook or next social media that would disrupt him to have, he's protecting his flank. And Google, when they wrote that we'll do no evil, watch anybody that says that, because the next thing that comes down is probably something evil. And I think they all get to a point, it's almost natural, because it is a very strong, it works. They have lobbyists, they can write the rules, they can write the regulations, they have the lawyers to withstand all the things you have to do. It literally is almost impossible for a company my size to completely operate within all the rules. You have all the regulation and paperwork and things that just will overwhelm you if you're trying to deal in any kind of space that requires any kind of interaction with regulation. And the way the big companies can is they have a huge budget for lawyers and they know the people to go to. So that is a real problem. And now that you have also, I think, government that's all too willing to sort of cozy up to corporate types and not just do the regulations and the rules, but sort of fund things together and talk about co-opetition between, it all sounds good, but what they're really doing is pushing down, and the little guy does not have that advantage. If you're trying to put a stadium here in Austin or in other cities, that billionaire or big corporation trying to they get all the tax advantages. Tesla gets tax advantages for being here in Austin. Where does that come from? The advantages to the small guy they don't have that. If I was a small car company, electric car company trying to compete with Tesla, I would not have near Tesla is Tesla mainly because of a lot of the government subsidized them to the point where they were successful. So that's a real problem, in my opinion. So
what is, because I think we did agree on that, is that there's just, you got to take the corporate money out of politics, because it just makes things completely slighted. So what would be your solution to this problem?
Well, I would take the politics out of the corporation.
Okay.
I think the problem is we have too many politicians. We have too many things are controlled by politics. So this is where my libertarian side comes in. If you shrink government, if you shrink the number of laws, if you shrink the power of a politician at every level, you're going to have real innovators step up. And you're going to have, I think, a lot of the interference created by those politicians not as tough to get around. So I don't think it's just that money is in politics. I think politics is in money creation. And actually, politics is actually printing money now, which is a whole nother thing. Right. So, I think when you start looking at like the what was the movement back in the financial crisis about Wall Street? You had the Bernie Sanders kind of folks. You had the hard left or the left wing really say a lot of things that I'm sort of agreeing with, in that the power structures it's rigged against them. It's rigged against the other 99% is the way they structured it. The 1% was rigging it against 99%. It's just the solutions they're pursuing are not the right ones, in my opinion. They're more destructive. And so it's true that the system is rigged. It's true that we're going further and further down that rabbit hole. And a lot of things that are coming out, and we can get into CRT and all these other things that are coming out now, I think are just smoke screens, really, for the powerful to keep the focus over here while we continue to build an economy that is more and more controlled by elites. And that in a sense is the China model. And that's the ones that that was the conversations that we were having is really what they're playing out. This is sort of the Great Reset. This is all of those things of the powerful, the big and powerful get bigger and more powerful. They believe in that. And so I think our best remedy against that is to enable the small. So when I say capitalism, that's what I'm talking about. True capitalism. True, if you have a good idea and you and I want to do business, there should be very, very little that gets in the way of us doing business together.
Fair. Yes. That I completely agree with. And I think you're absolutely right. The power in politics has always kind of been given to the elite, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it almost seems like that has been the structure of our political landscape ever since the founding of this country. I mean, to be able to vote, you had to be a male property owner, so that kind of makes a distinction between everybody else, even if they're hardworking and they're spending a lot of time and energy to devote to the economy. You still had to own property and be a man to a white man to vote at the founding of the country. So that almost seems like from the beginning, the powers lied within the elite. And so the system essentially has always been rigged. Would you say that's accurate?
Well, let me end that last conversation too. Like if you look at Enron, for example,
Mm-hmm.
Enron was a terrible thing, but what came after Enron was Sarbanes-Oxley, and what that really did is destroy the IPO market. So the ability for a company like mine to succeed is really just to sell out. If I do something really novel, Google will just buy me or something, and I'll make a bunch of money, and I'll take that deal, obviously, but it really should be that I should grow and disrupt Google. So it's not all just, I'm not all trying to make it out to be that there's some evil guy in the back pulling all the strings. A lot of these were well intentioned, but they just create this system that doesn't allow for the disruptor to exist. Going on to the next question that you had, this is a context question. Of course, that was wrong, but it was coming from a period of time where lords, which are landowners, it was evolving from the serfdom of the last couple centuries. It was evolving from a king and lords. Lords were landowners, and there were certain types of people. The novel thing that this country was built on, and why that revolution was different than the French Revolution was happening at the same time, is all these ideas that the people should be empowered, and that the governments shouldn't exist for the people, but the people, or the government should exist for the people, not the people for the government. Those were great ideas for the time. And the founders really struggled over certainly the race and slavery issue. In fact, almost every colony except one, who was the holdout, was ready to sign the original Declaration of Independence, that was to really get rid of slavery, which would have been living up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. Those were revolutionary kind of ideas that were corrupted by the fact that they had to win a war against the world power at the time, and there was pragmatic things, and there were people defending the institution of slavery in the South. I think South Carolina was the one holdout did not want to sign the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence at the time. So there was a real struggle and a real debate going on that issue. The landholder and some of the ideas that came down from all the way back to Plato. Plato really argued that democracy was really flawed, because you have to have a certain level of education or a certain status that otherwise it will descend into a populist movement, and it will be overrun by demagogues. So you did have all these ideas percolating around at that time of the Renaissance. These were great ideas. So I guess it's, in my view, we're letting great be the enemy of good. That in the context of what the alternative could have been, that was a milestone. And even with the slavery issue, which was the scar of, the curse of was the horrible evil that continued, they thought that was going to be a 20-year. We'll solve that in 20 years when we get past this turbulent period. Of course, that didn't happen. But it eventually did happen through a civil war and through a real struggle. So this is where I think, it wasn't rigged from the beginning. It's always rigged. I think the economic model of the country was not as rigged as it is now. I'm not sure where we're going with the other things. I hope we're going forward, not backward. But the economics, we didn't have income tax until the early part of the last century. And that was because of World War I and really the rise of progressivism, of Woodrow Wilson progressivism. So no, I mean, it's always rigged. Mankind will always be rigged. Mm-hmm. I think, though, are we going in the right or wrong direction? And I think lately it feels like we're going in the wrong direction. So that's to your original question, that I think it's time to stand up for what those values, those ideals were, even though they obviously weren't perfect at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and going back to the original question, like living up to the ideals, I think we kind of discussed this last time, is that I don't think people have a good gauge on separating their ideals from what's possible. They kind of they kind of blur the lines, and they elevate certain people. They put too much emphasis on these individuals. So, and I guess we can move into CRT, critical race theory, about like, is that something that should be taught in schools? Because I think that's kind of how we got into the idea of like whether or not there should be holidays. Because obviously, I'm super happy that Martin Luther King has a holiday, but at the same time, it's like, well, we're celebrating Christopher Columbus. It's like, I'd rather just there be no holidays. We get time off because people and students need to rest. But again, I think we have a hard time in putting people on a pedestal, and when they're and then we just place too much value on them, and then that's where you get the kind of, I think, the dogma rhetoric that comes out of placing people on pedestals, and you just kind of, maybe you take that out of the equation, and then people can focus on maybe the values a little bit more easily.
Yeah, I mean, Martin Luther King is a good example, though, of where I think we started to go down the other night when we were talking. Martin Luther King should be a holiday. The principle, the civil rights movement is, I think one of the things that we should celebrate almost the most.
Mm-hmm.
It really went back to the founding documents, or the founding spirit. Mm-hmm. Judge people by the color of the content of their character, not the color of their skin. It talked to a merit-based world, which again was novel, is still novel. Go to India. It's not a merit-based world completely. It's still enshrined in what class you're in and what which layer of the class, and that comes down from the religion, everything else, the culture, everything else. But Martin Luther King was not a saint. I mean, Martin Luther King, it's pretty well known, was a womanizer, had some issues personally. And so that, some of that's locked away in a vault. We may come out and he'll be a big Me Too guy at some point. Does that mean we don't celebrate Martin Luther King because he wasn't a saint, but his ideals, his speech certainly was? And so when kids are growing up, what is the outcome of celebrating Martin Luther King Day? Is that they'll listen to his speech. They'll see how he stood against tyranny at the time. It will talk about how he stood against tyranny, yet didn't fall into militarism. I mean, he chose the greater of his angels, at the time when it really mattered. So we don't celebrate Martin Luther King because of his marital infidelity, or we don't celebrate him as the best marriage ever. We celebrate him because of the greatness that he was in standing up on a really big, important topic that you want every kid learning about. So if we just make the day Civil Rights Day, or I think you'll miss that value, even though I definitely kind of agree with you on, I don't want to hold people up on a pedestal because they're always going to be knocked down. Nobody can stand on a pedestal forever.
Right.
None of us. So, but don't you, I mean, wouldn't you agree though that you want, the kids of America, or the kids anywhere, really anywhere, because it's a universal principle, mm-hmm. to learn about Martin Luther King, and especially his public life?
Right. And I definitely would. And to kind of clarify things, it was that, like, well, because I do think Martin Luther King should be celebrated and studied, but I don't think that Christopher Columbus should be celebrated. I think he should be studied without a doubt. And so if I had to go with an all or none approach, because you're going to have people on both sides saying like, no, you got to keep Christopher Columbus because he represents such and such. But I don't know that he actually represented the values of America. He didn't find anything, the Native Americans here. But
you mean Christopher Columbus?
Columbus.
Yeah, I mean,
the values, right?
You could make an argument that there's a better way to celebrate Western civilization. You could make an argument that there's somebody better. I'm sure there's always somebody better. It was a landmark that the date that was founded. I guess the problem is it's been enshrined in so many years that to pull that out and replace it with something else, I'm not gonna die on that hill.
Right.
I mean, it's not like going to bring down the republic or anything. It's just why we're doing it. I know, for example, my one of my kids goes to school, middle school here a few years ago when they brought a city council person that will go nameless for now, in Austin whose kid was in my daughter's class, to talk about Indigenous Peoples Day and how terrible Christopher Columbus was and all the bad things. And some of that started to shadow on not just Christopher Columbus, but what our society did and Western civilization did and all this. And there are a time and place to do that, but nobody countered. There was nobody that showed up and said, well, let me give you a different perspective. It's only one perspective being taught to this class. And that perspective, you walk away from not a balanced approach. And you certainly don't have anybody defending Western civilization there, because it wasn't just about, well, Christopher Columbus treated some of the people on the ship bad. And I don't even really know all the things. I think he was probably typical of any traveler at the time. But it descended from there to really all the evils of what became America. And that's not the time to do that. So I don't know. I mean, I think if you replace it with Christopher Columbus with, I mean, everybody I can name, you're probably going to say has some issues with. I mean, I'm not sure who embodies the spirit of what became what I think is the country that the world should look at and emulate.
Right.
The world would be better off and is better off because America exists. I guess let me ask you that question. Do you think the world's better off that Christopher Columbus or America or, actually exist? Would the world be better if the US or America never existed?
No, that I cannot say that. No, because there are a lot of there's a lot of evil things that happened, or not so great things that happened even before America got discovered. I think all of the issues that we're having today, I cannot, in an honest consciousness, say that things are better or there's more violence than there was, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago. It's just that, now we're able to share more information a lot more quickly. And again, when you have the elite writing the history books, they're obviously going to leave out some of the dirt that they did.
Sure.
So but I am very proud to be American. I'm happy to live in America. I love having conversations with people who have lived in other places. I will say that, we have a long ways to go. We're not perfect. There's been a lot of chaos that has come with the creation of this country, but out of that chaos, you also get the greatest amount of greatness that the planet has seen as well. You're getting all of these diverse thoughts, and it's like we're trying to correct it. Things do happen slowly, but I think it speaks volumes about how difficult it is for people to overcome biases, whatever that bias might be. And, as far as like history is concerned, I think we would do a lot better if we, maybe taught a more comprehensive understanding of individuals who were important to the history of America. And I wouldn't say that it means that it needs to be taught in a way and to say like this person was bad and this person was good, but really from just an objective standpoint, because I think you're absolutely right. I don't think the actions that Christopher Columbus engaged in were that much different than any other traveler at the time. Again, they were horrendous. I think, there was definitely an elitist type of mindset, a superiority type of thing about, go conquer, and just everybody else is beneath you, and just not treating others as life or as an equal. But that needs to be taught to let maybe even incorporate that. To that point, I had a thought like maybe even American history shouldn't be taught until you're in high school. maybe that is a way to approach it. I don't know, but I am very happy with America. We have a long ways to go. I think we neglect a lot of people that just have not had the opportunity to create influence. And I really don't think America actually fixes any things. I think you were right about there's a lot of smoke and mirrors designed to distract us. But America does not really fix anything until something breaks.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, and that's when you see some more significant changes happen. But
yeah, I just, the point of history, the only thing that's really important to me on history, I mean, I think there's a lot of context and we could go off subject a little bit, but I mean, the Spaniards who, in a sense, raped Mexico. I mean, not a sense, probably did. That came through. There was only about 500 of them that took over that country. And the main reason was that most of the indigenous people stood up against the Aztecs, and they were being terrorized by the powers that be. They did horrible rituals. So they, you've seen movies where they pull their hearts out and whatnot. And there's nobody without, the history of the world is not, there's nobody that's standing as the saint.
Right.
Unless you're a Christian, then you might say Jesus. But I mean, you don't have angels out there. And there's sometimes reasons why they had to be very harsh on I assume, on a ship that's crossed, you can't have authority go wrong and all that. But I think that context still needs to be delivered. But I think what's important to teach, maybe even prior to high school, is the ideals. Why was it important that all men are created equal? Why was that novel? What does that really mean? Why is the individual, which is what I would say is one of the paramount things the country was different on, why is that important that individuals have agency? Why is it, I do think those things should, because they're certainly getting indoctrination from other places, and they're getting indoctrination on TikTok and everything else. There needs to be a counterbalance against the culture that seems to be teaching something different than what some of those timeless lessons were. I think it's better to get into, well, Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. It's a complex issue. He was also very much in debt. He was both good guy and bad guy. But his ideals and what he wrote was genius. And at least that one document, and even the document that wasn't published, had a lot of things in it about his struggles with slavery and everything. It's really interesting to see that we need to say greatness exists, I believe. Sort of like Santa Claus. You got to say, well, Santa Claus, then you get a little older and okay, Santa Claus is not real. I mean, the more complex issues I do think need to come later, because but they need to hear that there's good here. Without that, they're going to be supplemented with things that aren't counterbalanced.
Yeah, I hear you, but at the same time, I feel like good isn't something that needs to be necessarily taught at such a young age. I kind of feel like children are inherently good. Like good is stitched into the fabric of who they are. Just running around the playground, chasing each other, playing games.
Oh, yeah. Do you have kids?
I don't. I do not have kids.
Some are, some aren't.
Right, of course. That means you get the bullying there as well.
They come with an innocence. Generally, they come with innocence. But I tell you, this is again going a little off subject, but between the age of 2 and 4, you can kind of tell the ones that are going to be jerks and the ones that aren't going to be. Right. They really do. You do have to really set boundaries. You got to give lessons. There's a lot of learning that goes on in those critical first years, even though you certainly can't have a complex discussion with them. So It does have to be dumbed down to, Santa Claus is this symbol of something good, and I know some people will argue, well, then you have to lie to them later. Oh, mommy, you lied to me about. I mean, come on. I mean, I understand that argument, but it's innocence. I mean, I think we need to have an innocent time in our life, and children need to be innocent longer than they are now. And so if we have to lie a little bit to keep innocence together, I don't know. I don't think it's a bad thing.
Yeah, yeah, it's I mean, but okay, so you're saying that children need to be taught the values of our country, but again, I think maybe the only values that I'm thinking of that an elementary school student should be taught would be like, you know, fairness, sharing, maybe patience. I mean, what else does a child at that age really need to be taught? What other values are important that they need?
Courage, standing up,
Yeah.
bully on the playground, stand up for what's right, universal principles. I'm not, again, not in a complex way, but the basics, they really do. You don't resort to violence because you're angry. You don't hit your sister or your brother or whatever, which they do. You got to teach that right away.
Mhm.
They'll take advantage. They come out with innocence, but there's an animalistic component to it that you got to control. You got to deal with. And so I think those principles are important. So I just see I see a value, and one of the reasons superheroes and all those things emerged is they were originally the ideal, and there are reasons why humans, you know, gravitate toward these narratives, and humans need it somehow embodied in something they can understand, touch, and feel. And sometimes that's a superhero, sometimes that's a hero, sometimes it's a hero on the sports, you know, in sports. I mean, I know as a kid growing up, there were heroes I had in sports, and you know, there's hard work that's rewarded, you know, excellence that's taught, you know. You know, I think as they get a little bit older, you got to say, look, that hero worship needs to fade, and you need to focus on those principles. I just think that's a hard thing to do to a 5-6-year-old or whatever. They've got to have heroes.
You know, I think you're absolutely right. I think they do need heroes, people to look up to. But I think an argument could be made that the people that they're looking up to are probably like professional athletes and celebrities. I don't know any child whose hero is, you know, a founder of the country or a president for the most part. Maybe a few, maybe there might be a few out there, but they're definitely not. There's not a large majority of them or a significant number of them. So again, I don't know where the value is, and maybe.
Well, no, it's not as easy to say you know, some guy that wrote something is important. I mean, but as they go through school, I mean, it starts off with a very just symbol, Santa Claus charity, you know, a great ball player. I can see that excellence, but we as adults should try to, I think, get some other heroes in there that are more substance oriented than just playing a sport really well. You know, so it evolves. I think it starts off very basic, hard work pays off. Then it turns into, you know, loyalty, principles, and then it goes into the more complexities. Well, just because these people said that, they didn't always act that way. Your mommy and daddy weren't perfect. You do need to introduce all that to them. I just don't think you need to do it. It needs to go in stages.
Okay, I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that. And on that note about like teaching children kind of the correct values. So you are in an interracial marriage, you have biracial children. So how do you feel about critical race theory like existing in
Well, let's start with
structures?
what do you define it for me?
Well, I guess, I mean, you basically probably gave me a little more history of it last time we spoke, basically saying the theory was that systems are have inherently racist um, tenets ingrained in them. And you think that is false.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I know. I mean, I've known about critical race theory for about 5 years. I've known about postmodernism and liberation theology, which went back to when Obama was just coming on the scene, and Reverend Wright goes back to Black liberation theology, which came from also South America, was liberation theology. These are all, in my opinion, really bad things. And they kind of all come from the same, and I've struggled with saying, when I say they, whoever they are, it's always, I hate when people say that. It's like, who is, there's this one person, and I don't believe it is that, but they're really, really bad ideas. And ideas can turn into evil, and then action, and then people embody those ideas. And I really fear that we're going down a really bad path with some of these bad ideas. And those ideas are the main reason I don't like those ideas. And I can go into what critical race theory and postmodernism, and it goes way back to postmodernism and the Frankfurt School, and there's different people that brought it forward, and then there was they've embodied it now into a racial component. But there are all kinds of critical theories. Critical theory is not just critical race theory. There's critical queer theory, and all kinds of different theories that fall into this critical category.
Well, if you want to, if you want to touch on the specific ideas that you think are dangerous, please do.
Yeah. So the first part is it treats everybody as a group. It looks at everything. It's almost, it is not almost, it's a cult-like religion. And if you really dig into the literature, and none of these things I'm not exaggerating any of these ideas. If you go back to their ideas, they're worse than what I'm saying. If I quoted them, or if you look them up, they're more extreme, let's put it that way, than what I'm saying. And it starts with that you have no agency as an individual, which right there, you lose me on that. But that liberation theology, for example, says that you as a group, or we as a group, get to heaven or get to salvation. And that people are really just part of a group and not part of an individual. And this is kind of where, this is where Marxism went. And so it has component. Marx, the only difference between some of these theories and Marx was Marx only looked at class, where now I think they've realized that race is more incendiary and more emotional in the US, particularly in the US. And so it's got more ability to take root. And so the first part is the group versus the individual. And then it also goes to group that goes back through the generations. And you and I kind of got into that discussion about how different ethnology and things like that, which I do not, we disagreed on. But when you no longer have your agency as an individual, and that I basically carry the sins of my group, whatever that group is. And by the way, grouping is a skillful art. You can group anybody in 100,000 different ways. You can look at me as male, you can look at me as white, you can look at me as straight, you can look at me as such a certain income level. You can, I'm in the data business. You can fragment data in all kinds of ways to tell your story. And so the idea of grouping and not having responsibility to what I do, but what my group does, has the most, it goes down a path that turns into, well, in its worst cases, the things that happened in the last century. That's what happened at the beginning of the century with both fascism and communism, and what goes on in North Korea today. So I think the fact that this is emerging today is really strange. It definitely allows people to get power. I think some of the authors that are really pushing it with like White Fragility and some of these best-selling books, I think they're white people, by the way, but for them, I believe it's a power grab. It's a way for them to sort of be a hustler and get prominence and be invited to give speeches and make a lot of money. But there's the idea itself leads us down a path of tribalism. It leads us down to a path where you're going to have tribes fight. You're going to have, you're not judging people based on the content of their character, but by the color of their skin. It's the most antithesis to Martin Luther King that you can come up with. And it's couched in this idea that it's just understanding, it's couched in, it's a fraud the way it's couched and the way it's presented. Now it's starting to be exposed now. Like, for example, in the last election, one of the debates, I think Chris Wallace asked Trump what was wrong with having, sort of just understanding and having, sessions where you understand the other side, having empathy for a person of a different color or a different status. That is not what critical race theory is. And it was amazing that the elites, that they should have known better. And then, Trump being Trump sort of stumbled over it. Well, it's discrimination. That actually doesn't explain it very well. And it doesn't explain the incendiary nature of it. So when we start going off on it, I think it's a wolf in sheep's clothing. It's not what you think it is. If we're talking about trying to figure out how to empower disadvantaged groups, I would love to have that discussion, but I don't think the discussion can descend into groupthink and tribalism. And, well, this tribe beat up on this tribe years ago, so now let's have this tribe beat up on this tribe, and people are guilty by things that they can't control. I think that's a really, really bad path.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would love to touch on the topic of like, how do you empower disadvantaged groups? I would definitely want to touch on that. But at the same time, it's like you're saying grouping is dangerous, and it's like, but grouping is what we've been doing in America. We don't even need to go back as far as before
it was
America.
bad.
It's like it's what we have always done. Like political parties are grouping. It's like it's the easiest way for people to think about other people, period, because it takes a lot of energy and effort to try and think of the individuals that exist in a group.
Yeah, but so what's the point that you're making there? The fact that it was done in the past and it was universally now, there was wars, civil war fought over it, and then it turned into Jim Crow laws, and if you had, a certain percentage of Black in you, you were classified in this group versus that group. Even within the Black community, there was a brown bag test. So a lot of things I learned once I married my wife, by the way.
I bet you learned a lot.
There was all these different, all of that's bad. And we put law in, and really since the 60s, these all became illegal. You're not allowed to, or it's illegal to discriminate based on immutable characteristics, the color of your skin. And it's regressive. It's going back to a time that's predating the civil rights era. It's just changing the group. And it shouldn't even be controversial. I think a lot of it is, I'd really like to talk to somebody that really believes in it, because I don't understand where they're coming from. And I'm trying to wrap my head around. I think a lot of people that talk about it are talking about, mostly don't understand it or talking about something different. They're talking about, dealing with white people don't know what Black people are doing, and it'd be good if they had an appreciation, if they understood some of their stupid statements and some of their inherent racism that might be built into what they're saying. All of that is definitely good discussion. And, people say stupid things all the time. And if you get into an environment where, my wife grew up in, a white school or whatever, and there were kids that wouldn't date her because she was a different color, and all those are good discussions to have. But again, the solution is not the right answer to that problem. I would love to have a discussion without getting into Marxism, and if you read some of the literature, it's clearly coming from that class, that Marxist kind of viewpoint, and takes it to another level with postmodernism. Postmodernism basically also says, this other tenet that I can't deal with, is nothing is objective, everything is subjective. And you hear that come through all of our culture now. It's my truth or your truth. and there's, there's one truth. There are different perspectives, and people can come to different conclusions on the truth. We're all pursuing the truth. Nobody really found the truth. I'm not saying I got the truth over here in a bottle, but it's the pursuit of one truth that we're all looking at the same. We're trying to pursue a truth. There isn't the relative nature of postmodernism, and it came out after the world wars, was that, there's just no absolute right or wrong. Everything's relative. That leads us down a really bad path.
Well, I think everything is relative to a degree, because even when you're talking about, people saying that, like, or attempting to be objective versus subjective, I think people really struggle with that, because people
Sure.
are emotional first. So even to get to a place where they can realize that, like, oh, I'm not thinking objectively, that is a huge leap and bound. And if I had to guess, the proponents of critical race theory, because I'm not exactly sure what the right answer is, it's still kind of a new subject to me. But if I had to guess, the supporters of critical race theory, what they're trying to do is get the groups that are in power to recognize, just simply recognize, first and foremost, the disparities that exist. Would you agree that that's accurate or no?
Which part? That's their intent?
Correct.
Who's ever pushing it?
Correct.
No, I don't agree.
Okay, what do you think they're
I mean, I think it's a power grab. It's easier to put people and divide people, and then you've got power. I think from a political standpoint, it's easier to particularly Black people, keep them in the Democratic Party at a 90% clip or 85%. It's going down now, but at a one party group, it's easier to keep that, the boogeyman out there being this white racist that's embodied as a Republican Party. And I'm not a party guy, but I'm just saying it's definitely a way to split the races or the parties. You could argue that the Republicans did that in like 94, when or was it not 94, 04, when Karl Rove kind of used the gay marriage issue as a wedge issue to push the needle toward George Bush winning the second term. And I think that was probably correct to some extent. He realized a bunch of people were on that one subject, we're going to fall into this tribe. And now gay marriage has changed radically, but at that time in 04, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, everybody was against gay marriage supposedly. And then they flipped, a decade later, and it became a different politic, because politicians do that. But those were wedge issues. This is a wedge issue of the day. This is the easiest wedge issue because it does have such emotional appeal. It's easy to sway emotions. It's easy to lead people off a cliff, or lead people into war, or lead people to, the atrocities that we lead people to if you get their emotions on your side. It's really hard to make an argument. It's hard to talk about data. It's hard to talk about like logic and get people to follow you. I mean, it's better. Hopefully it stays in longer, but it's easy to be a demagogue and be a great orator, and then focus in on an emotion and then take them to where you want to take them. And so critical race theory is brilliant at that. And it changes language. It plays with language. So it's insidious, I believe, by design. So are the people that are pushing it all that insidious? I don't know. But I don't think most of them that really know it are pushing it for the right. If they really knew it, I think they would reframe it. And if they knew its history, where it's coming from, the disciples of critical theories in general, don't think they would push it other than a hardened communist. And I don't say communist lightly. I mean, that's exactly where it came from. I think Marxism and communism failed in its attempt to indoctrinate into the US over economics. Just lost that argument. It's easier to win the cultural argument and kind of key in on something that is the Achilles heel of America, the great sin of America, which is race and all that. So that's what I think is behind critical race theory, and that's why it needs to be exposed, in my opinion. I think the conversation about understanding where others come from, I think we were winning that argument. I think we were moving in the right direction, and I fear that this. I don't say this just because I have biracial kids. I mean, I say this as a human being, but I do have biracial kids. I don't want to have them divided as to which are they going to go on mother's side or father's side. I mean, that's, you know, that's not a healthy. Now they're not going to. I don't have that struggle in my family, but that's sort of the outcome that seems to be where we're going. So that's why I'm so against it, and I think it's one of the big things that we've got to start exposing and talking about. I think what was winning, you know, when I married my wife in I should know this, in '98. When we met in '94, I called I came from a kind of, I don't know, I shouldn't say this because this is recorded, but I came from, you know, not an upper class white family in Cincinnati, which is very segregated. But, you know, when I called my dad and I said, I'm bringing a new girl around and she's black, you know, he went crazy. He's like, oh, I can't believe you're doing this to me. And I, if you know my personality, I'm kind of a contrarian. I didn't care, you know. I told Stephanie to wear African garb and go over with us, but you know, just to kind of poke the needle. But you know, after they met, and then as time went on, and very quickly, my dad ended up really coming to like Stephanie, and it was sort of breaking a long held. And my dad didn't like a lot of people. He had a lot of problems. He's been long gone, so it's. But he's had a lot of problems with all kinds of people. They didn't go to the wedding of several of my sisters because one was Protestant and the other was some other issue. So, but it was good that evolution was happening. And then, you know, if you would have looked at when we got married in '98 and took a survey, I think the surveys at the time were almost evenly split as to those that believed in interracial marriage. It was, I think it was almost against. And recently, as recent as a year or so ago, I think it was 87% of people were very much in favor of interracial marriage. And really the only 10% left are probably some people that are just old people. However, some of that percent now is coming from this idea of that race means that much. Like they're committing genocide by interracial people getting together and creating kids that look sort of white, look sort of black. That there's some sort of racial identity that we're attacking now by even us reproducing. Colonization is going on because hopefully I don't know what kind of rating this has, but I'm colonizing my wife every time we have sex. I mean, come on.
Right.
So, I mean, these ideas are percolating again, and they sound to me like what the Ku Klux Klan would have said in the '60s or whenever. They sound like the same people that would say these white supremacists, wherever they are, these nasty people, are the same things coming out of some educated communities right now that are preaching critical race theory, and that we need to go back into our tribes, and we need to go back into this idea of race means something. It means nothing. It literally means nothing, and it should be that going forward. Now, does that mean that we don't want to talk about history? We don't want to talk about the fact that, you know, my nephew, I have a nephew on my wife's side that was actually the child that saw Trevin Martin get killed in Stanford, Florida. He was the 13-year-old boy that was walking the street or walking the dog. And so he had a lot of trauma in his life over race and different things. And, you know, we went down a few years ago in Florida, and he kind of looks like a rapper. He's got some hair. At the time, he kind of had long hair, and just, anyway, yeah, he had some guy come out when he's parking his BMW and was yelling at him because he thought he was a gangbanger, and he was with us, you know. And so does that happen? And the guy that was done, wasn't a white guy, but it was, I think, somebody from Cuba or whatever. But does that happen? And then does that happen to him where it didn't happen to me? Absolutely. There's a long conversation that we ought to have about that. And there are ways to talk about that in a way that's not putting us in groups and saying, well, the only way to solve that is to get back at this other group because this group was bad at one point. Let's get back. I mean, this is the Hatfield McCoys. This is eye for an eye. That leaves everyone I think somebody said, that leaves everybody blind. I mean, all that's going to do that is not a good solution for going forward. And so I don't know what the temperature for interracial marriage is now, but we don't have, it's in my lifetime, it went from, I mean, really, when I was born, I wasn't legally able to get married to Stephanie in Florida. I mean, that's how old I am. And in just my short lifetime, we went from being sort of, an oddity or just an aberration to almost being like every commercial I see has an interracial marriage, has an interracial couple in it now. Mm-hmm. So that's a really good thing. Let's keep going. Let's not regress.
I completely agree. Like
a long answer to your critical race theory.
No, but I mean, there was so much information in there. There were a few things that I want to touch on. Because I agree. We all need to get to a point where we realize there is only one race, and that's the human race. But in the example of your nephew, yeah, in the example of your nephew, like, how do you tell someone that, like him, that race doesn't matter when his experience is that much different? To say, like, to have that happen to him, some stranger yelling at him simply because of the way he looks, and then to look and say, like, well, race doesn't matter, because for so long groups have been told that race does matter. So how do you even get to a point where you can say objectively that race doesn't matter without realizing the lived experience of someone else?
Yeah, so does race matter in practical life? Yeah, in some circumstances, particularly if, when he went and got a job, he cleaned, so he cut his hair, just like a white guy that would have tats and you got to clean yourself up to go get a job. We all need to do that to some level. So some of it was the fact that he was kind of, that just kind of his choice of the way he chose to look. Now, he can't choose to have a different skin color, and I wouldn't suggest that he should. And he will be in circumstances where somebody will judge him based on that. And when I married my wife, we had circumstances where people would say things, and in different environments. Again, I think most of it is about power, frankly. I could care less if some bigot in the corner is looking at me in a certain way. In fact, if they're looking at me, they're kind of like, wow, you were able to get that, you were able to get that girl. That's, at least in my head, that's the way I'll take it. I mean, I don't care.
Right.
And she's better looking than what you're with, if it's a bigot, I'm just,
I guess.
But, my point is some of it is, you aren't going to change the world. You can't, we're never going to have a perfect world, but it's more about what the power position is. If I don't care, when I went to China or whatever, I'm the only American non-Chinese guy, and there were guys that would look at you a different way. And there was some, especially in China, the male, there's a macho thing and about the Western male that they kind of aggressively sort of feel like they kind of want to come over and challenge you to something. But if I walked in and you carry that with you, as long as I'm not in a less powerful position. Now, some of the circumstances where somebody who is a certain race is in a less powerful position, say going in for a job interview, and those are challenges we got to deal with. But I don't think the solution is for me to tell my nephew, you're always going to be having people look down on you, or you're always going to be disadvantaged because of your race. I don't think it's the right solution. I think the right solution is stand up and find the people that you want to, in the bigot in the corner, ignore them or don't deal with them. If you're in a place where you think, you're going to be threatened physically, then you got to be aware of that. Same way I have to be aware of being threatened physically in certain communities that are all Black. But generally, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I don't think you can eliminate all those problems of that race does matter. What I'm saying when I say it doesn't matter is in reality, it should not matter, and shouldn't matter in your head. And by saying it matters everywhere, or preach the solution that we're presenting, that you need to be cognizant of your race, you need to be there are circumstances where you do, but those are rare, that we're putting it in our head. And if it gets in your head, it's worse than external. I can take care of the external more than I can take care of what's in my head. If I go into a situation and I feel like the odds are against me, or I feel inferior, which is also a problem, that I can't do this, or I can't overcome these odds, or that everybody will always push me down, you're not doing a favor to that child, to that kid. And I think that's what we're doing a little bit. Anyway, again, long answers. I'm sorry. I'm kind of
no, all good. No,
we cannot instill disadvantage in our head.
Right. And I think and that's such a deep subject, like instilling disadvantage in your head, because disadvantage is also woven into the fabric of capitalism. It's about winning. So it's like we understand from a very young age about, winning and losing, which is, if you're a loser, you're at a disadvantage. After a certain point, not everybody gets a participation trophy anymore. At a certain point, when you suck, and you have to, as a kid, like maybe this sport isn't for me, or I need to move on. So you just stop trying. So it's like disadvantage is something that we are very much aware of, even before we're taught about the complex structures that exist in America. But I think you're right that you have to like decondition yourself and really understand that like you aren't at a disadvantage, and at least try to see yourself on the same playing field as another one. And maybe that person has other strengths than you do, but I think that's, you have to also realize your strengths, and where, everyone has weaknesses, and nobody's impervious to having weaknesses. But it almost sounds like, because I think critical race theory, from what I gathered, it almost seems like it's just it's a political term, it's a catchphrase, but I think it's mostly to get people to pay attention. It almost sounds like it's the exact same thing as you trying to get your father to give value to who your wife was. You want to poke the bear a little bit, so you have to give some talking points. You want to be a bit of a contrarian, and that's kind of what the advocates of critical race theory seem to be to me. They seem to be doing exactly what you're doing, and they're being a contrarian to the status quo, just to get people to pay attention and try to think differently.
Yeah, I would disagree on that one.
Okay.
And so, for example, some tenets of critical race theory, if you go to the African American Museum in the Smithsonian, I believe it is, in Washington, and I haven't been there, but there's they talk about this in 2 + 2 = 5, and that being on time is a white manifestation of white society, of white supremacy ingrained in our culture. It goes to the heart of rationality. It goes to the heart of the Renaissance. It goes to the heart of logic, that everything we see, whether you're conscious or unconscious of what's going on, it's the reason why things are the way they are is because white supremacy and racism is everywhere. And it sounds ridiculous, but read the literature on it. Read what they actually say. And look at some of the manifestations of it in like a museum that's sitting in Washington. Are we to say that whiteness is about being on time or being hardworking, and that blackness is not? What is that teaching? Who does that? How does it manifest itself in that way? Anybody that would say, well, I'm just using critical race theory to talk about the racial issue, I would challenge them to say, well, how does it end up there? How does it end up that when I say be on time, I'm being a white racist? Because that doesn't end well for my nephew if he hears that message and he embraces that message, that I am the way I am because it's built into me, or I can't imagine the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan devising a better scheme than that to hold Black people down, and to or anybody, or a society, which I think is maybe part of the thing going on here, to tear a society apart when it manifests itself in those kinds of outcomes. So I don't think critical race theory is just about racial awareness and, hey, wake up, Black people have a different experience. And not all Black people do. Black people are people. There's some that grew up in impoverished areas, and there's some that are, billionaires. And there's some that, I mean, they're people, everybody, they're individuals. So yes, there is a conversation, and to use a term that I don't think ever means what it means, that we need to have about, like, just be tolerant and judge people by their character, get to know them first before you just make a rash decision or rash judgment. Those are all good things. We should have that conversation, but that is not what critical race theory is.
Right. And you know what, it's because I think you're right. I think there are people that overcorrect, and to teach a group of people that being punctual is a negative thing, or it's something that you've been conditioned to do because it's what fits the narrative of another group of people. I think that's completely wrong. I think it's an overcorrection, and I don't know if that represents the entire theory of or if that would be validated by the originators or the writers of the rule. But yeah, I hope
it would be, because it's rooted in critical theory, which comes before critical race theory. Critical theories, the critical part of theories, and there's a lot of literature on this. The critical part of the theories is that it's everywhere, and it's everything that you subconsciously can't see, and therefore the whole system, the baby needs to be thrown out with the bathwater. That you can't dissect and say, well, this is wrong, that treating people, having that this incident is wrong, but this is right, that the whole thing needs to be thrown out. That's what the critical part is all about. And that I find insidious, and seems to have a more insidious agenda behind it. I don't think that most people that embrace it even know that or care that I think most of the people that are embracing it are emotionally attaching to, well, finally we're talking about race. Finally, we're starting to get into a conversation where Black Lives Matter, to use the term, and I'm using it not for the group, but the actual meaning. That I understand that emotional impulse, but once you read about what really it is, and then see how it manifests itself into, like I said, the Smithsonian, or where it takes groups of people in NASA and throughout, and people that are engineers at NASA or in the military, and then takes them separates them by race, and talks to white people differently than it talks to Black people, and that there is a subconscious bias in the most ridiculous things you do. It's manifesting itself into real things. And that's where I think it's dangerous. I remember having this conversation like 5 years ago, because a lot of the literature came out within colleges, like, these are just crazy college kids. There's always a crazy college professor. Nobody's going to embrace these theories, because these theories have been around for a while. The critical theory has been around since, even the modern versions of them. But in the last few years, corporate boards are bringing them up. The language has entered corporations so quickly. And I'm not exactly sure why. I have theories on that, but I don't really know what that's about. But it's infesting our society and our thinking quicker than I would have thought. So I hear what you're saying, and I do understand it, and I can understand why it would seem that way. But if you really look under the covers and look under the hood of this, it has a more insidious nature to it, that it's not what you think.
I hear you, but I really think that what we're finally hearing now, it's the people that have it's just such a complex issue that you can't ignore it. I don't think you can just say, like, ignore it and, like, try and find value in and try and understand that you're not at a disadvantage, because I think it's if you, like, look at it by class, perhaps, if you grew up in a certain neighborhood, you probably experience a different level of racism than somebody who grows up in an affluent neighborhood. It's just going to be a little different, and you can't ignore those disparities. And I think a good example of that might be the fact that, let's say if you have a speaker, a presentation speaker who is 6'5", and a white American male, and he's 6'5", he's going to get more credibility than the speaker who is 5'9" and a white American male. It's like really just trying to understand the psychology of how we operate, and we're doing it in these really abstract ways, and when I say extreme ways, critical race theory would be an extreme way. And I would also say having the narrative of pull yourself up by your bootstraps and pretend like nothing's wrong is also an extreme way. It's attempting to avoid these intricacies and treat people as, even individuals, as these monoliths, and we're not. It's like we're more complex than that. Just because we literally just seeing someone who's taller is more credible than someone who is shorter is a bias issue that's just ingrained like in our DNA. So it's like bringing attention to that is, I think, the important thing. And maybe I don't think either school of thought is going in the right direction about it, but I do think it's a conversation that needs to happen. It's probably just a necessary next step because it is such a complex conversation.
I think for the most part, though, I would not conflate. I mean, you're putting critical race theory into this conversation about bias that is inherent in human beings. And I don't think it belongs there. I really don't. I think it has, it's not about, there's a grain of truth, I guess, in it. And there are certain little elements that seem to manifest itself into, this is just an extreme example of looking at just the racial component and taking it to the extreme. It is not, in my opinion. There's a grain of truth in that race does play a role in way people judge, and it's sort of innate. I mean, it's innate that you kind of gravitate towards somebody that looks like you. It's innate that, like you say, that there's all kinds of things that are innate, such as the height of somebody, the attractiveness. I mean, are you telling me you don't talk to a pretty girl differently than you talk to? I mean, some of that is controllable. I mean, but most of it's not. I mean.
I didn't say that. I try and talk to everybody the same.
Oh, come on.
They're all pretty. I look for the inner beauty.
But the point is okay, that's the world that we're in. We didn't create the world. That's the world of imperfect human beings trying to interact with each other, and that there should be some attempt to expose that, and I think for the most part, we were doing a great job on the race issue. That, beauty is now, when I married my wife, I thought she was beautiful, and she was flat out beautiful. And yet that wasn't the embodiment of beauty early on. And then it's now, so cultures do change and can change. And I thought they were changing to a great degree. But it's really what you do with the world that we're in. It's kind of, again, what is the solution? And the solution is not to embed that into your. So if I was a coach of a football team and you were a coach of the other football team, and we were playing a game, and you guys were bigger, faster, you guys had all, you were projected to beat us by 30 points. With the speech that I give to my team before we go out that you have no way of winning, you're too slow, these guys are going to run over you. No, I would try to figure out a way to win. And I would instill that the game is not about who wins. It's really not about who wins or loses in the actual sport. It is really your character and how you rise to the occasion and use what you've got to overcome those challenges. And I don't think we're doing any favors by overemphasizing or we're getting into a different subject than critical race theory. Critical race theory doesn't even talk about that. This is more about, yes, you got to have an appreciation for, I might be disadvantaged based on the fact that I'm too short or something, but I'm going to overcome that. Steve Jobs had a bad father and he was an orphan, but he overcame it. Michael Jordan, I think, didn't get it was cut from his sophomore year in high school. I'm not sure if that's true, but it makes my story better. So But I mean, it turned out to be Michael Jordan. I mean, he worked hard and got through it. So the solution of how you deal with that is what we need to instill. Nigerian Americans make more than white Americans in the US, and they're Black. We do have people come to the country and do well, even though they probably have hurdles. I'm sure they have had hurdles, but I guess that's where I differ. I think of all the things really holding American, and this is where we get to solutions, all the hurdles that are holding a Black kid that's coming from maybe a tough area down, race is way, way, way down the list in terms of what is really the determinant factor of whether that kid will get economic success, success in life in many ways that you want to define it. And by even saying that, it's sort of like, well, you're a white guy, you would say that, or that's not true. I mean, I should be able to say it and not be judged. You should be able to look at the data and talk about that. And I think that's the way we overcome it, is we do start to kind of rise above our, reptile brains, where we just go off the first instinct. We have a discussion like we're having. We kind of try to appeal to logic, and we try to reason and talk things out. And by doing that, you do get to a higher plane of how you actually exist, I believe. And then you get to a better place. And I don't know if we're going to get to free speech, but that to me is where this whole thing starts to also unravel, is free speech, and all this needs to be part of that to get to that higher level. That's our solution. Just talk it out, get to a higher level, other than just, hey, she's really a pretty girl. Well, have you talked to her?
Right.
She becomes a lot less prettier when you talk to her, and then you start to realize, but when I'm doing Tinder, or I'm not doing Tinder, but if I was doing Tinder,
Your wife might see this thing.
Yeah, exactly. Honey, this is just a joke. This is just an example. But, I'm just looking at the visceral thing. And we should teach everybody to look beyond the Tinder. We should teach. So that's our solution, right?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, we have to have conversations about this. I think this dialogue, this back and forth, the willingness to listen and hear the other side is just critical. But again, I kind of think it speaks to the structure of our society, in that we really we just yell at each other until things break. It just seems like that has been the history of our nation, is we just yell until something breaks, and then we fix it a little bit.
Well, the history of the nation, I think, was the best out there. A bad solution, but the best, better than every other example, in that we did debate and we did talk.
Yes.
To the level you could at different times in history. And I do see that under assault as well. The free speech, and this idea that there's speech that you can say and speech that you can't. It's coming together with critical race theory. It's coming because critical race theory is comes from a Marxist background. They're trying to put people in buckets and then give them an orthodoxy, and anything outside that orthodoxy, you're canceled. I mean, cancel culture, all of this is coming from a place that I think is, we talked at the beginning of the podcast about why I think Western civilization and really the foundation of the country is at risk like never before. Free speech has never been at risk. Censorship is like now commonplace. And it's coupling with this idea that think in terms of your group identity. It's all kind of intertwined. And I think the solution is free speech. The solution is dialogue, real dialogue, not platitudes and slogans and, crazy little boxes on corporate buildings that say, hey, yeah, we're one of the good guys. I mean, we have identity politics in the fact of whether you wear a mask or not. I mean, that identifies you as a certain group. It's crazy.
But that's all part of free speech, though, yes?
Well, no, I think it's I mean, the fact that somebody can wear a mask or not wear a mask.
Well,
Oh,
or if a corporation's posting a sign saying this is where the good guys, that's all part of free speech.
oh, I'm not saying that they should be illegal. What
Yeah.
I'm saying is it comes from a spirit of just putting a mask, just putting, a symbol up so that you really won't look underneath and really investigate and really have a conversation. I don't think a slogan, a bumper sticker, I don't think a black box on my social media, any of that I think it is the antithesis of actually talking through things. I'm not saying that it's all bad and, you should have symbols, sort of like what we were talking about before, if we all unite around a symbol. But most of it, I think, is just posturing. It's all theater. It's because they don't really want to have a conversation, if you really want to say that. They really don't want to dig into things. And that is the remedy, I think, for all of this. And so when real conversations start happening, the big tech starts censoring. And I never would have believed, and you could say, well, we can get into that conversation of whether they're the free market, it's just at play with censorship. But it's certainly against the spirit of what the country was based on, Western civilization was based on, is vigorous debate, but then have a beer afterwards. I think the beer afterwards has gone away. We don't even really have a debate. We go into our little echo chambers and say how the other side sucks. And then you come out and it's yelling and not a debate, really. I mean, I would like to have a lot more debate and more of okay, let's have a cocktail afterwards, because we're coming from a good place. We're trying to vet this out. We're trying to figure out what is the right balance between, dealing with racial issues and really making sure that we have kids succeeding and being excellence in what they're doing in life and all these things. It would be great to have real conversations about that, but I think we're going the opposite direction.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I think, with the rise of social media, what it's doing, it's giving just social media, before you even get into race, it's giving people a voice who are typically pretty quiet in the real world. It's allowing them just to get their idea out there, because they're probably not going to say it in any setting, race related or not, even if it's just on their favorite movie or an opinion about who won the world championships. It's like, because they just might be introverted or conservative or depressed or whatever, they won't do it in a public setting. So I think it's a little more sincere than just posturing. It's I think there's so many thoughts and ideas and feelings and emotions out there that it's an attempt at doing that. It's saying, this is where I stand. And most of these people engaging in these Twitter wars or Facebook fights or whatever it is, they'll never do it in public. But it's a way for them to, I guess, express at least a portion of themselves that feels unheard or suppressed. And it's more than anything, it's attempting, I think behind it is a desire for real connection. It's a desire for dialogue. It's not as it's not as planned as posturing. I don't think it's gotten there yet. I think it's more in its.
I would say that was the ideal starting out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it had some great advantages of being able to have a communicate. I mean, we're in the same city, but we could be in a different city and having this dialogue, which is great. Although we're not really on social media as much as we're actually having a direct dialogue, interactive dialogue, where I can see your expressions and we're reacting to each other. We're not. Social media doesn't have accountability a lot of times. I don't have to actually sit in front of you. I don't have to worry about, I don't have to be polite. I can be anonymous to some degree. I don't actually have to look you in the eye, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think the downsides and where it's devolved to, I think the original intent was good and the original promise was good. It's devolved into an echo chamber of just finding people either that agree with me or finding people that don't and canceling them. And by doing so, I can be a bomb thrower and I can critique without any consequence. if I go up to somebody in person, I at least have to have empathy for the person. On social media, I need no empathy. I can destroy them without thinking, without having to deal with the reaction of the person. I mean, you see suicide rates among young girls skyrocketing. I mean, Jonathan Haidt wrote a book, Coddling of the American Mind, and he's cataloged all this. If you can see it right when social media was kicking in. And a lot of that is because girls got their identity, and more so than boys. Both of them went up, but girls by exponential rates. And then in 2020, it looks like it's doubled. That's a crisis. And they get their identity by their reputation. The way typically females destroy each other more so, where guys will fight it out. More often than not, females will destroy each other's reputation, and their reputation means a lot more, and that can be destructive to an adolescent. And it is. I mean, the data shows that. The scoreboard is bad on that. So yeah, I think the promise of social media, and certainly like what we're having here, is great. And I wish it were uncensored more than it is. And there seems to be a controlling element to it all of a sudden, which I didn't see coming. I thought that was the promise of all this, is there'll be unfeathered conversation. But now it's conversation that's acceptable and conversation that's not. And I realize you can have bad actors that enter that, but I think we were talking when we were at the bar the other day, or last week, was, the example that the liberals that came from the liberal side of the political spectrum was the example of freedom of speech, where in Skokie, Illinois in 1977, the neo-Nazis marched through, and Dershowitz and the leading liberals of the day in the ACLU was sort of their landmark case as to, yes, free speech is that sacred, that we need to have every voice heard so we can stamp out, or we can at least try to address the ones that are absurd, but we can have everything sort of talked about. A lot of these movements that are going on, critical race theory is probably most noteworthy, but there's a lot more than just that. Are you coming up with their own language? It's coming up with things that nobody knows what it means, because they're making it overly complex so that dialogue doesn't happen, that you can identify who's in the camp and who's not by language. These are techniques that have been used by tyrants throughout the year. It has a history of creating new language as to how we interact. And so to me, if we had to narrow down the things to your first question at the beginning of our dialogue, what scares me about, like, what is changing, point to what is the boogeyman that I see, it is that all these things are sort of intertwined, and that this is freedom of speech, and our ability to really address it is being attacked by cancel culture, by censorship, and in some cases even by the law. And emotionalism is taking over rationality.
That is, yeah. Well, again, I just think more people have a voice, and the promise of social media, and now they're suppressing some speech. It's just so complex, because you're talking about, if everyone were empathetic. Empathetic is such an advanced concept. It is so difficult to be empathetic to someone who has a different experience than you do, in my opinion.
Do you think so?
I think it's an extremely.
If I see somebody in pain, I mean, unless I'm a sociopath, okay. Mm-hmm. If I see somebody in pain, I feel pain. I feel empathy. If I see somebody, so the way to address the racial empathy in the past was desegregation. If everybody just had a friend, or they had colleagues, this would go away. That was the theory, when I was a kid. It was not always well played out with busing and different reasons, but the whole theory was, let's get everybody together and empathy will take over. We're going the opposite way in that regard as well. We're going now toward, racial only groups, and it's not the solution. But I think empathy, generally, if I'm not a sociopath, I hate to see somebody cry. I hate to see, I love to see somebody laughing. It's contagious. I have a hard time doing that over Twitter, or I have a hard time doing that without visuals or without the physical world. And that's one of the differences between the media. I'm not saying all of the social media is bad. I think the points you're making are great, that voices that aren't, we go to those meetings and we're the ones talking because I talk a lot, and there's shyer people that are more deliberative with their thoughts, and you do want to bring those out. I think it has that potential, but it's degenerated from there into the one with the largest megaphone, and then these cliches and some of these things are replacing real thought. Like, people, you ever talk to people that they just speak in cliches? Like, you don't even know what that cliche means, do you? Well, and I just know it's what I'm supposed to say. And I think that is unfortunately a more common, I think that is a human thing, is I don't want to have to actually put brain power into actually thinking what I'm saying. I'll just latch onto this concept and throw it out there.
Yeah, and I think that is that's a form of empathy, just finding what's acceptable and what's palatable to the other group. But I do think, I still think empathy is a really hard thing to practice. And that might be something that's just kind of ingrained in you. Because even speaking to your relationship, I can probably imagine there are a number of people that didn't pursue a relationship simply because their friends and family would not agree with. That's just too big of a hurdle to jump. So, I still think it's a really hard concept to practice, especially, if you are a quieter person, more conservative, like you probably would like to be more empathetic, and you see someone in pain, you'd probably want to feel more pain for that person, but you probably have conditioned yourself to not do that because it hasn't been shown to you throughout your life, because you've just been smaller of stature, just quieter in personality. So I really think it is a difficult thing to practice, because it goes back to I think it's been associated for so long with weakness in America.
Well, I think, so I want to be clear, like, racial sensitivity training, if it's really that, is great. And I think there are many ways to do that. And most of it is get people together. I really do believe that. But yeah, I grew up in a Black neighborhood. I kind of grew up at a time where there was a lot of racial stuff going on. And when I was a kid, like, there was the 60s, essentially. I grew up, I was born in 64. So walking to school, and all my friends that I had were Black kids. And at that time, I didn't even know that was a thing. And then all of a sudden I went to the white Catholic school, and all of a sudden, really, even the white Catholic school wasn't bad. When I went to high school, oh my God, the racial segregation was big. And everybody sat at one table that was Black. Everybody sat at one table that was white. And these were kids, like, these were friends of mine that we went to school with in grade school. And so racial sensitivity and getting that right is definitely worthwhile. And so I want to make sure I'm not I think all that we need to do more of. So empathy for where somebody comes from and they don't know what it means when you walk in a room and people kind of look at you twice. I got it when I started dating Stephanie, and we were in the Midwest, and I lived in different parts of the South. Midwest was worse than the South, ironically, and even Southern California like Orange County was two places that wouldn't rent to us. And I'm like, the lady was above us, and she came down, and so you like, all of a sudden, wow, that's empathizing with something I didn't experience before. I didn't know that people were really that way, but I'm like, I knew people were jerks at different levels, but yeah, to feel it would be a great thing for everybody to sort of experience to some level. It's not the same as critical race theory. It's not the same as grouping people. It's not, and it's not saying you have inherent evil because you don't have that background. It just means try to empathize with this other group that you don't really understand that well, because you grew up in an upper middle class white place. The only Black guy you saw was like a certain type of Black guy that was all fitting into the group and spoke the way you did and everything else. And you get out of that comfort zone, you don't know what you're dealing with. So, so empathy in that regard, I think we got some work to do. think though that generally people that interact are have more empathy than those that don't. I think we ought to, there's things we can do to bring out the people that don't have a voice. And maybe to the extent social media can do that, I'm all in. But don't censor. Let's not kill speech. And then let's accept people that are different, that say different things. I mean, if they got bad ideas, they'll lose the argument eventually.
Mm-hmm.
Let's hear them though.
Right, right. I completely agree. There has to be more constructive conversations, and you have to be willing to hear uncomfortable ideas from both sides.
Can I ask you? So I started listening to some of your previous podcasts. I didn't get through them. I got real busy, but I was trying to listen to them today to kind of. And you had some folks that were on. I don't remember who it was that were against interracial marriage, or were. Well, where does that line of thinking come from?
Yeah, that's yeah, I do have some friends of that school of thought, and I think well, I don't think it stems from the history of America, and I'm for those who said that, I hope I'm not misrepresenting their ideas, but it's just dealing with so much discrimination, racism, oppression over years and years. A buddy of mine, he came down and he interviewed one of his biracial buddies. You know, he grew up in Texas also when segregation was just kind of ending. You know, and so he was a mixed guy, light-skinned black guy, but you know, going over to his friend's house and the father saying, "Hey, I think you're a real nice guy, but you're never going to date my daughter." You know, having to grow up with that, I think, you know, it just, and you're experiencing it over and over and over and over again. And if you don't have enough time to decompress in between those periods of judgments, then it causes you to be callous. You build up a callous, and you don't want to let anything in that represents or seems to represent the group that was oppressing you.
Yeah, but you're describing how one could get to that point. It would sort of be like describing why I maybe would have said, well, my father is saying this, I don't want to create. But don't we want to encourage people to go with their better angels? I mean, don't we want to encourage, I mean, in my case, I don't know, I didn't care. I mean, I knew it was the right thing, and I like this girl, I don't care. So maybe I just had a different way. But I mean, let's say it was something that was hard for me to overcome, because I don't really think that was hard for me to overcome. I'm not influenced by my parents if they're saying something that's wrong, and it was just wrong. And but if it were hard, I would hope, like, hey, the right thing is to go this direction. Yeah, I might lose some relationships with my parents, but I'm going to go this direction. Same thing with this, is I'm callous based on this history, maybe justifiably so, because of bad things happened to me, or my nephew who had some, you know, these very bad things happen to him. That the message needs to be, resist that temptation to fall into the damage of your past. So to then embrace the idea that we don't want interracial relationships, I just don't understand why that's a good goal to shoot for. It might be what is inherent in you, and you might say, I'm not going to date somebody out of my race just because I have this in my background, or I have this pain, and that's your prerogative. Not everybody has to have the same preferences, but to say that it's a bad thing for Black people and white people to intermarry, I don't understand that. I mean, I guess it gets back to this idea: am I part of a group, or am I an individual? Mm-hmm. I don't sit here holding a flag of the white people of America, or I don't hold a flag of, you know, Irish descendants. I mean, the IRA did horrible things. I'm not going to go back and say I'm for the. I'm here as who I am, and if I like this girl, I'm going to date this girl. And if I really like her, I'm going to marry her. And if I you know, if I don't, I'm going to do what, you know, I'm going to go on to the next thing. I'm an individual. So it to me, everything kind of boils down to that. Are you looking at things as an individual? Are you assessing all the things and then making the decision based on the right, at least what you perceive as best you can, the right thing to do? And so how do you get to that conclusion and say, well, I'm against interracial marriage? I mean, who cares?
Mhm.
I mean, why would you care? Like, okay, maybe that's not my choice, but why would anybody say, well, you can't do that either, or you shouldn't do that either?
Yeah, and I agree with you, because I think I agree that eventually everyone should try to strive to a point where they start thinking as an individual. But I think the example that you gave, about like, oh, I have to have a tough conversation with my parents and it's going to create some distance, like how difficult that is. Even like in a parent child dynamic, just going against the grain and losing the emotional support of your parents. I'm sure deep down in your heart, they're both going to love each other, but some people aren't even willing to risk that emotional detachment from their parents just simply by saying something, going against them. I know a number of families, where their child is in the 30s and 40s, and they still won't bring up conversations to their parents about, just the ideas that they have. And it's interesting. And a lot of it's like STEM and culture, but I think that speaks volumes about how hard it is to detach like from your emotions, and just how important it is to a lot of people um, to risk losing someone losing the support of someone close in their life, even if it's for a temporary period of time. To me, I feel it's important for me to speak up and speak my mind to, like, my close family and friends. And, if they disagree with me and they feel like they need to take some distance or space from me, that's something that I'm willing to accept. I understand, because it
Yeah.
is more important for me to stand on my independent thoughts, rather than if I know that, rather than, go along with a family or friend simply because it just makes things more accommodating. But
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two thoughts there. One is the individual struggle that you're articulating, and I would argue on that point, I would say if you carry that with you, it'll stay with you. If you don't address it, what doesn't get addressed doesn't go away. It just
right,
embeds itself and comes out as cancer somewhere later. I'm
right.
not metaphorical cancer.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't address the elephant in the room, the elephant doesn't go away. It actually
Mm-hmm.
gets bigger. So that's just a personal thing. But no, I'm just even talking about, well, okay, I don't want to marry somebody outside my race because of my family won't accept it. That's my individual choice. Fine. But I'm just saying, to take a position that interracial marriage is detrimental to society to some level is coming from the left now. Or I don't know what you would want to call it, progressive. I don't even know what, it's not even left right thing. I don't know, but it's coming from the Black community now. In some cases, that are the ones the community that's sort of embedded with this critical race theory concept, in that it's committing genocide to the group, that it's almost like the Black person is rejecting their race by diluting it, and all of a sudden we're all going to kind of look sort of light-skinned white people, or light-skinned Black people. That's where a lot of that is coming from. And again, it's this concept of, I've got some obligation to my group, my race. I have no obligation to my race, none. I have an obligation to marry the best person I can find, and I have an obligation to my kids, and I have an obligation to do the right thing. So I just would love to have a conversation with somebody that had the opposite point of view on that, as to why there's a defense of the group, or certainly of the race. I mean, I could, you might want to defend people that have the same values as you. Obviously, I have values and I want to defend these values, and so it might be detrimental to the values of the family, but defending a race, to me, is the antithesis of what I think we should be trying to do. I just want to, I don't understand where that idea is coming from.
Yeah, yeah. And again, I think it just comes from centuries of oppression, like literally just not being able to, for instance, if you're a dark-skinned Black person
Mhm.
with dreads and you're walking through, an affluent white neighborhood, you're probably going to get some looks, just feeling like
Sure.
that you can't go anywhere without judgment being passed on. I for the most part can pretty much walk around anywhere and feel like nobody gave me a second look. It's like I'm trying to wave at people like, hey, how are you today? Like, give me a little bit of attention. I'd like some.
You're a good looking guy. You get looks.
I think it's mostly because, maybe sometimes my tattoo, they're like, that's probably why I get my looks.
No, but the dreadlocked example that you're giving is why. So how does that manifest itself into a belief that I don't want to dilute the race? I mean, that's an example of pain that can come from an uncomfortable situation that shouldn't be there. But how does that then translate into a belief? Well, because this pain exists through history or even through the present, why do I advocate for don't make sure you only marry within your race?
Right. And I think maybe the best way that I would think to explain it might be staying with the example of, like, someone with dreads. If they're going to predominantly white school, or they're walking through a predominantly white supermarket, they might get, or at work they might get lots of questions, like, and they might not even be mean questions, but it's like, oh, that's different, or how do you do that, just, or what do you do with your hair, just like a curious, like, because, oh, that's different, and you get that, day in and day out, or week in and week out, but repeatedly. And let's say, whenever that person goes back to, where I grew up in, or not grew up, where I lived for the past pretty much 10 years in Southern California, where my grandfather's house is, it's right next to Leimert Park, a historically Black neighborhood, and if you're a dark-skinned Black person with dreads, the interactions that you're going to get are probably like, oh, where do you get your dreads done? Oh, your dreads look so good. Oh, that's so good. How long have you been growing your locks? And it's less from an objective standpoint of curiosity and more of acceptance. And it's just like, rather than people questioning, even if it's comes from a good place, it's still a question, because it's like, oh, well, I'm not sure if I like that or not, because it's different for me. It comes from a place of, the questions are coming from a place of acceptance. Like, I like that. That's different. That's dope. And so I think when you're coming, and again, that builds up. And I think it's like, okay, I just feel safer in this group. I feel more comfortable in this group. And eventually you're just going to want to spend more of your time and in that group, and then you say, I want to spend my life with someone from this group who understands. So you're not having to constantly articulate why you choose a certain style, or defend why you choose a certain style. I think that's where it comes from, because it can be draining to constantly articulate why you choose to do something, rather than just explaining to someone, for someone who wants to follow in your footsteps.
That's good explanation. That makes, so would you think that the same people that would defend that position have a problem with a white guy from Appalachia that doesn't want his daughter having, or his daughter marrying a Black guy?
They probably, some of them would be like, yeah, that's fine, I completely get it. And they wouldn't be like, yeah, over there.
Right.
They'd be fine. Yeah, there are still some of my friends and even family who support segregation. They're like, no, it'd be great if Black people have their own space and white people have their own space and we all lived happily ever after. They would still support that. I don't necessarily support that. But they would, a lot of them would probably be like, yeah, that's great, do you. But I think where that comes from, it's like, I guess the number of places that white person can go and feel accepted versus the number of places that the Black person can go and feel accepted.
Yeah, I know, but the white person from their perspective is saying, it's uncomfortable for me, let's say, as the Appalachian white guy with my banjo or whatever I got, sitting on the porch, to have my neighbors, my friends are going to say something. I need you to don't bring home somebody that's going to make me feel uncomfortable. I mean, comfort is in the eye of the beholder.
Right.
And to some extent, you could justify everything from comfort. I mean, life's not comfortable. I don't think on an individual level, again, kind of moving from macro to individual, which those are two separate conversations, macro and individual. But at an individual level, I would tell my kids, if they had those kind of views, that don't take the comfortable path.
Mm-hmm.
That's, you want to make a good life. Don't pick the most comfortable path. It's not the way to grow. It's not the way to actually get to happiness. Do the hard things, do them well as best you can, and then happiness and accomplishment is greater achieved from that. If you follow the easy path all the time, you're gonna end up miserable and frail.
Right.
But anyway, that's an individual thing. Do you, on the free speech issue, do you hold the same belief that I do, that free speech is under assault or is a sacred value? I mean, there's this discussion these days where there's hate speech, and then and I would argue there is no such thing as hate speech. That there is speech that incites violence. There's speech that is criminal, which is defined, but the concept of hate speech, which is just ingrained bad ideas, or that I'm just a bigot or whatever, is I don't know, it's not me. I'm just saying the figurative me is my right to be a bigot, and I kind of like to live in a country where the bigots are identified. I kind of like to know, if I go in a place, that guy's, got the Confederate flag, and at least I know where he's coming from.
Right.
Confederate flag's not always what it means. But I'm just saying, he's holding if he had he had the Nazi symbol on him, at least I know where he's coming from. I don't have to figure it out. And I think in a country, again, because I think freedom is so much more important than uncomfortableness. I hold that value sacred, and so therefore he should be as bigoted as he wants to be, as long as he doesn't harm me.
Right, and that I support. Like, I think Trump being elected president was good for America because he gave the bigots more confidence to speak out, and he just magnified what was already there. And if it's magnifying what's already there, it's going to force conversations. And that's why we're having these conversations now. And I think that's a valuable thing. But yeah, I think that's where it comes. It's with, any bigots that exist or racists that exist. Like, I think the fear with that is that can easily lead to more violence. Because I completely agree that, like, free speech is a sacred value of our country, but you really have to make sure that it's not leading to violence or destruction of property even.
Well, I mean, so a direct incitement but anything short of a direct incitement may lead to violence because it rouses somebody up, but it also may be the way that everybody suppresses the powerful suppress some speech they don't want to hear. And I don't think pushing it underground makes the violence go away.
Right.
In fact, it festers, and particularly in the internet age, you're not going to stop people from engaging, even if you wanted to. And I would not want to. I don't want to live in China. I want to live in a country where there is a little risk, but I'm free. I'd rather live in freedom with some danger than no danger or safety, but locked as a slave, or locked away, which is what I think China, certainly North Korea is. But for example, there is a lot of bigotry on all sides. I mean, a Farrakhan is certainly espouses bigotry toward Jews, toward whites, everybody. Yet he has free reign. I think he still has his Twitter account and all that. I want him to have it, but bigotry there's a lot of bigotry going around these days, and it just seems like the censorship is all on the right, and it's a characterization. I think it's largely a characterization. And I think a lot of it is driven by the powerful wanting to direct the narrative more than it is to protect society from some perceived threat.
Say that last part again. You think it's more
Well,
about?
I think it's mostly, yeah. So all the censorship, if you look at, and we could switch from race or any of these things to, COVID. The idea that somebody said, well, you know what, that there's this Wuhan lab, and I think it came from there. The plausibility that that's where the virus came from is very high. And there was a bunch of doctors, they all got censored until recently for some reason. And I think it's because there's things coming out now that make it pretty obvious that it was the Wuhan lab. Why would that be censored? Why wouldn't that idea be able to be presented, vetted, and just shared? And then, hey, I don't agree with that, but that's one idea. Nobody knows. And that was, and now you're starting to find all kinds of email interactions that say that there was a suppression of that speech because of some agenda. And you can speculate on the agenda from Fauci on down. So we can't have that. We can't have that. And ideas that come from other things. So my statement was, I think it all has agenda as to why censorship is happening. It's not because they're trying to be magnanimous and protect people from, some Nazi that will shoot somebody because they got riled up. I literally don't think many of those people exist. But even if they did, it's not why they're censoring. They're censoring because they wanted to have one narrative go out. And certainly in the COVID case, I think you can make that argument. I think there's a lot of other cases you could make that argument, but certainly the COVID and the lab story now is full circle.
Yeah. Because I mean, again, protecting free speech is important. But like, I don't know. You just have to be very careful about making sure that this free speech on whatever side or on whatever extreme it is, that it doesn't devolve into violence. And that.
But how does the scenario of talking about the Wuhan lab as being the source of the virus, which people were a year ago and they were censored, doctors were.
I think that's a problem. Yeah, that's a problem. Absolutely.
Yeah, and no, I just lost my train of thought. I had another great example.
Oh, come on. Maybe it'll come back to you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of examples of where, things that they seem to have an agenda behind them. And that's the problem with censorship. It never goes, that's the problem with most of this stuff. It always sounds like, well, it's well-intended, and maybe it is first, but it's always degenerates into the powerful using it for their own purposes and their agendas. And I'm not saying all powerful people are doing wrong things, but it's pretty much power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely is a really good axiom. And big tech for right now in the media is so powerful. Big tech in particular, they could shut down your servers. And they did. They're wielding that power in ways that I think should scare every good liberal, should scare any leftist that used to argue the corporations were the evil, which they kind of are now, and they're coupled with government. So I really think whatever disagreements everybody has on what side of the fence they're on, what race we are or anything, I would hope we can all come together on, let's all vet it out. Let's keep the conversation going. Let's not have something called free speech thrown away in the bathwater of critical race theory. Let's not bundle these really good things just because they came from a slave owner back in the day, Thomas Jefferson or something, articulated something about speech. Let's not throw away what is essentially the only solution we have for going forward, other than descending into tyranny. If we start protecting speech that we don't like, when the person gets in power that you don't like, you're going to have your speech curtailed. Mm-hmm. It's not going to stop, and so those things are really, to me, the things that we all need to come together on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. I agree completely that we have to have conversations about these tough topics. It's just the issue, like when we're talking about free speech, it's like usually these extremes, and when the extremes are talking, they're not really interested in hearing the other side. But it doesn't mean it needs to be censored. It doesn't mean that it needs
Well,
to
and
be.
I'm not even, I mean, that's not the speech I'm really worried about. I think
Mhm.
that it's hard to draw the line. So that's the examples that are used. The free speech that I'm talking about is political speech, is the speech about the Wuhan lab, the speech about, if I, for example, quoted you CDC statistics that say taking the vaccine, if you're an 18-year-old male, particularly somebody that's already had COVID, you have a disproportionate, a highly, there's studies showing that heart disease, myochondria, or whatever is coming from that. And the CDC has announced this. Just quoting the CDC statistics would get you censored.
Yeah, that's a problem. That's
It's staying away from the message because they think it's their job to treat us like children and make sure that we're all, and I got the vaccine. I'm not an anti-vaxxer or anything like that because I'm 50, almost 7-year-old dude. I mean, the risks to me were higher than the negative aspects of it. But if I'm an 18-year-old kid, my daughter who had it already, I'm not suggesting she get it. Anyway, the point being, why can't we make those decisions for ourselves? Don't, just get the information to us. We'll make good decisions. We'll make the decisions for ourselves. I think there's this new line of thinking with the powerful, and especially big tech, that there are parents and they're going to feed us what we should be fed so that we all stay in line for whatever agenda or whatever reason. And I think we all should rebel against that. White, black, left, right. We need to stop that because it will come for us someday. It'll come, maybe it's coming for your enemy now, but it'll come for you next.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Cancel culture, the same thing. Stop the cancel. Let's just stop.
The cancel culture is a little different. That's free speech. That's free speech.
It's mob rule, though.
It's still free speech.
Sure. So I don't want the government to stop cancel culture. I don't want somebody to be arrested for canceling somebody. That's not what I'm saying. But we need to train. We need to shame it into the ash pile of history. It's corrosive. You need to have redemption. Some people say stupid things. Some people did stupid things in their past. They shouldn't be condemned by the mob. We don't want to have Salem witch trials. We don't want to have, and the internet is empowering and enabling a Salem witch trial and a modern version of it. That, so-and-so, so-and-so may not even said that or meant that. The context is out of play. And there's all kinds of examples of that. But the mob can destroy somebody, many times with an agenda, many times just because out of ignorance. But that's we're going back to Salem witch trials if we're going to accept that as a society. Now, like I said, I'm not talking about throwing somebody in jail for that, but we as a culture need to really shame, and I think shame has a place in culture, shame that activity of canceling almost all cases. Let individuals shame each other. Let individuals make decisions. The mob should not be telling me who should be canceled and who shouldn't.
Yeah,
it's a form of suppression of speech. You're not going to have anybody speak out. I had somebody. I said, "Hey, I'm going to go on a podcast tonight," and they're like, "Oh, Dave, don't talk on any kind of recorded line." Like, maybe I'm like, I run my own business. I'm not. I speak my mind, whatever, and I don't think I'm offensive, but. Somebody's going to take it out of context. If they become your enemy somehow, they're going to take something, record it, take it out of context, and you're going to be sitting somewhere and like, I didn't mean that. And like that can't be. Yeah. Well, is that a threat? So that if I believed that was a real threat, I wouldn't be talking to you.
Right.
That's suppression of the dialogue, and we don't want to suppress this.
I agree. You don't want to suppress dialogue. And I think what we're seeing today with cancel culture, it's an overcorrection. I think, again, with the development of social media, it's giving a voice to people who have felt unheard for a very long time. For whatever reason, they've just felt like they've never had a platform, or that when they have spoken out in a public setting, that they've been shamed or, just made to feel unimportant. And I think that's what it is. The fact that so many people are latching on to this maybe reverse bullying.
It's very, yeah, bullying was bad. Reverse bullying is bad. Racism is bad. I mean, I think when we say it's an overcorrection, I kind of take exception to that word, because it's going in a different direction. It's not just a bigger push in one direction. It's going in the exact opposite direction. It's saying that those that didn't have a voice now have the voice to trample on somebody else, that they have the right to do that for some reason. And I think the idea that they have a voice is not tempered by somebody. By canceling somebody else does not give them any more of a voice. It just allows them to trample on somebody else and suppress voices. It actually allows them to suppress other voices that they either find offensive, or in many cases that they just want to suppress for whatever reasons.
Right. And but I think for the people that are doing it, it's that illusion that it's putting them in a better place. It's that illusion that we're shaming someone else to lift ourselves up. It's like they've just done something that's extreme. But that's kind of where I think it's at.
Yeah. Well, I am getting calls from my wife.
I figured that. I knew we went way over our planned hour.
Yeah, so, you're good. You're a good man to talk to. You do a good job of this. I don't know if you've been doing this for a while, but you got a good voice for it, and you asked good questions, and I enjoyed it.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate you joining, and I look forward when we get to catch up again, maybe grab a drink and go right back at it.
All right. Sounds good, man.
All right, Dave, take it easy.
Take it easy.